welcome back to the Unbreakable podcast, a journey of healing and hope. I'm your host, Christy, but you already know that. This is your co-host back here, Bailey, who just had a minor freak out. So in last week's episode, I talked about the hydrocephalus and the brain herniation and how that was really the catalyst for my mental downward spiral. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. I think I'm going to keep the same format I've been keeping, where I'm just going to state the medical facts and then offer my perspective on that. And since I've last recorded, I've gotten several comments from people who have a family member with the same injury that I have who is looking at a really long recovery. And so a lot of the things that I talk about is going to be from a perspective of me talking to that person and also their family, hoping that I can give them a little bit of insight into what their family member is experiencing. That way they can better care for them. The hydrocephalus incident, I had a temporary shunt in my brain called an EVD. I was also back on the ventilator through the trach, and for the next 4 to 6 weeks, I battled with pneumonia and a liver infection, both of which, again, put my life at risk, especially the pneumonia. I also talked about in the last episode what I experienced with the hydrocephalus, how my sedation wore off and I could hear things and feel things that I shouldn't have. And it was a long time before I could really communicate that to anybody because I couldn't talk. So a lot of that I just internalized because I had no way to tell anybody. I mean, I couldn't just have a conversation with somebody and let them know that, hey, I'm not okay. So I just had to deal with it the best I could, and that really snowballed my mental kind of downward spiral. I developed severe anxiety, mostly regarding my neck. I would not let anyone get close to my neck. I would freak out. And when you are on a trach, you have to be, or at least I did, because I had pneumonia, I had to be suctioned a lot. And anybody that's ever had a trach will tell you to get suctioned is just the absolute worst, most terrifying thing, and it feels so invasive. It literally feels like it's sucking. You feel like you're gonna die. You feel like you're never gonna breathe again when you're getting suctioned. And there were certain people that were more gentle in their technique, and so I started kind of picking and choosing who I would let and who I wouldn't let suction me. And I remember I would even, like, if I had secretions that I could feel, I would just be really still and really calm because I didn't want anyone to know that I needed suctioning because it just was such a horrible experience. But anytime somebody would get close to me and even like reach like they were going towards my neck, I would freak out. And that's I think I still have a little residual of that, but I got super paranoid with my neck, and I also got super protective of my little bubble. And I wrote, again, a blog post about this, but something that I wanted to touch on, something that at the time to me was a big deal. It's not a big deal to me now because I'm so far separated from it, but at the time, and I'm saying this because of the comments that I'm getting from people who have a family member in this same situation, at that time, one of my biggest obstacles was people invading what I considered my space And you have to remember, a patient like that, they have no control over anything. The only thing they can control is whatever they can physically move. So in a way to kind of assert some control, I got really picky with who I wanted doing things to me, and I needed people to talk to me. I needed constant reassurance, and I needed people to constantly explain things to me. I needed to understand what was happening, or I would just really spiral out of control and freak out. But the problem with that is that I was still on all these heavy medications to keep me sedated, to keep pain under control. So you have somebody that's mentally in a bad place, who's mentally suffering and can't communicate, also who's on a lot of hard drugs, one of which I was even on ketamine at a certain time. So they're not rational. So it's an impossible situation for everybody involved. But one thing I will touch on that maybe I can offer some insight for people who have a family member in this situation, and people who are watching these videos who are caregivers, nurses, or whatever. I would often fall asleep, and I would immediately wake up, and I would think that I was out for 4 days when it was 2 minutes. So I had no concept of time, and I developed ICU delirium. It is an actual medical condition that long-term ICU patients get, and I definitely had it. But one of the things I struggled with the most during that time was, for example, I would wake up and someone would be suctioning me. And in my mind, they didn't ask permission. They didn't tell me what they were doing. I just woke up and they were doing that to me. And it felt very violating, and it felt very intrusive, and I would get so angry. But in reality, they were telling me, but because of all the drugs and the ICU delirium, I wouldn't remember that, and I would fall asleep and wake right back up, and all I knew was that I woke up to being suctioned. And so I wanted to be isolated. I did not want anyone touching me. I felt very vulnerable, and I had no control over anything. And it really made me struggle mentally. I also had 2 children that I had not seen, and it was COVID. I wasn't allowed more than one visitor. There were all these rules, but I spiraled so much that the rules were kind of broken for me, and I got to see my kids a couple of times, which helped. But then I started with the liver infection, and I first started showing symptoms with just a fever, and at that point they had not figured out what the problem was, but every night my fever would get really, really high. In fact, my poor dad can probably convert Celsius to Fahrenheit really, really well now. But my fever would get up to 105, and they didn't know why. And then they found out eventually that I had a liver infection, and they had to go in and drain my liver, or drain the infection from my liver. But another thing that was very prominent in my bad memories was, while that was going on, my fever would get so high that they would put cold packs on my neck, my armpits, my groin, and a cooling blanket. So it's already cold in that room. And then I had ice packs and a cooling blanket, and I was suffering. I was absolutely suffering. And I don't know what protocol is. I have no idea. I'm not an ICU nurse. But if at all possible, you have to put a patient on a cooling blanket and ice packs, sedate them, knock them out. If you can safely do that, don't let them. That is torture. It's just absolute torture. I don't really know another way to say that. And I'm not an ICU care provider of any kind, but in my opinion, it's borderline inhumane. At least that's how I felt. I felt like it was inhumane to experience that without being sedated. It was awful, and there was nothing I could do about it. And kind of back to the feeling violated that I was talking about, weeks later when I was in rehab, kind of the same thing happened, but it wasn't with my trach. I woke up in the middle of the night with a nurse inserting a straight cath, which in reality, I'm sure that she woke me up and told me what she was doing, and maybe I fell back asleep. I don't know. All I know is that I woke up with my legs spread and someone inserting a straight cath. In her mind, she may have thought she was trying to get in and out real quick and not disturb me too much, but that also sent me down another, like, all the improvement that I had made was wiped away immediately with that, because I felt extremely violated and I was hysterical. I think I cried for days and could not properly communicate what I was feeling. And on the side of being the healthcare provider, they're going in there, they got to do this cath, they don't want to wake me up. Like, I get it, but from my perspective, that was a horrific thing to experience. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, to the very best of your ability, if at all possible, tell them what you're doing over and over and over and over, and you're still not going to get it right every time, but that was really difficult. I felt vulnerable. I felt like I had no control. I felt violated, and then I couldn't really explain how I was violated or why I felt that way, and it was really just a recipe for severe depression. I was also working with PT at that time. They would come in and try to sit me up on the side of the bed, and that halo, I don't know how much halos weigh, but when they would set me up, I swear it felt like it weighed 1,000,000 pounds. It was the hardest thing. It felt like I was like a Navy SEAL in training or something. It was brutal. And anyone that is on the ventilator long term like I was, they usually, or let's say it's not uncommon for them to develop pneumonia. Well, I had aspirated on the initial day of my accident, and then I was on the ventilator for a while. I was only off of it for a couple of days, and then I was put back on it. So I developed severe pneumonia, and unbeknownst to me, it was also threatening my life. My husband was prepared again several times that the pneumonia is really bad. She may not be able to come off the ventilator. She may not live through this. Well, I didn't know that. All I knew was people were like really rooting for me to get off the ventilator because they were trying to wean me off of it. But there were a few times where they would turn some settings down, and then I would just get really tired and really struggling to breathe. And I would actually ask them to turn the ventilator up, and which they would have to do. But I've talked about this before, and I'm not saying that they did anything wrong. I'm just offering my perspective. So do with it what you will. If you have a family member in this situation, this is just my perspective. So of course they were not going to tell me, hey Christy, you have really bad pneumonia and you may die. Of course they're not going to tell me that. So when I would have trouble breathing, they would kind of coax me a little bit and like, you're just worked up, just slow your breathing down, calm down. And it made me feel like I was crazy. Like there was some shame. Like, why can't I get off the ventilator? I don't understand. I'm trying so hard. It's not working. What am I doing wrong? So I had like this sense of this is my fault somehow, and like I was failing and not strong enough. I was blaming myself and feeling really weak, but in reality it wasn't my fault, which later when I found out that no, I was dying of pneumonia, it was validating that I wasn't crazy, because I felt crazy. I felt like it was my fault somehow and I was doing something wrong. So I'm not saying if your loved one is going through the same thing to be like, no, you're not crazy, you're dying. Don't do that. I don't know that they could have done anything differently, is what I'm trying to say. I just don't. I don't know that there's anything they could have done differently, but that is how I felt, how I internalized it, what my brain told me was happening. So during all of this, which I've already talked about before, some of you have already seen those videos, but again, now I know more than I knew the first time I talked about it. But my nurses, Stacy was my main nurse, and I had several RTs. I remember Connie and Veronica, Lori. There were probably a couple more, but those are the three that I remember the most. But I remember Stacy telling me, if you get off this ventilator, I'm going to get you out of this room, because I had ICU delirium. I was at this point in there for over 4 weeks in the ICU, not been out of that room, no sense of night and day, no sense of up or down. Well, the day came where I was finally weaned off the ventilator. I still had the trach with just some oxygen, but I wasn't on the ventilator anymore. And because I was in such a bad place and had been through so much and was really struggling, Stacy, with the help of another nurse, Haley, and Lori and RT was there, Connie and RT was there. Lee said it took them about an hour and a half to get me moved into like a reclining chair that rolled. And I still had the EVD, so they had to take the EVD, all this suction equipment. I mean, they had to take all kind of equipment, but they didn't just get me out of the room. They took me up to the helipad on top of the hospital, and we got to watch the sunset over Children's Hospital. And the helipad is also the way that I came in the hospital. And I remember for some reason, I remember seeing the helipad, and it was like a metal grating. I don't know it's just different than what I thought it would be. I now remember that for some reason. But it was me and Lee, Stacy, Connie, Lori, and Haley. They took me up to the helipad, and we watched the sunset, and they took all these pictures, and I cried like a baby, hysterically. I think I just sat there and cried the whole time. I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, because I mean it just as much now as I ever did. But my favorite part of those pictures is to zoom in and I look at Stacy's face and the way she's looking at me, and I love the way she's holding my hand and I'm holding her hand. That picture is a candid picture, and it kind of says everything to me. It shows the compassion that she had for me, and it also shows the trust that I had in her. Stacy is not a doctor. She's a neuro ICU nurse. She's a very experienced neuro ICU nurse, but I trusted her implicitly, like a child trusts their mother. That is the same feeling that I had towards Stacy. She was probably the most important person in that part of my life, because she was, other than my family, obviously, other than Lee, I'm trying to say the most important care provider during that time. But the fact that they went through all of that trouble to do that for my mental well-being speaks volumes. And months later, I was interviewed, and UAB wrote an article on it, which was really great. They interviewed me and my neurosurgeon and the ER physician that took care of me, and they wrote this story, and it was really good. And it was talking about just the interdisciplinary teams in my case and how they all had to work together for this outcome. And then, like, months go by, and my phone starts blowing up, and I have people sending me videos and telling me that they just used my story on The Good Doctor on ABC. And I was like, what? And sure enough, I pulled up the video, and they referenced my case. I mean, they did the whole thing. So that was crazy. It's pretty wild to know that your story got put on a TV show like that. That was really cool. And I like these two pictures together because they're actually pretty close to the real thing. I know that the people that work in critical care don't often see great outcomes. And I know that you go home sometimes wondering if is this really worth it? Can I keep doing this? And I can't answer that for you, but I can say that there's going to be that one patient somewhere along your career that you absolutely hung the moon for that patient, and that you are everything to that patient. And I don't know if that's enough to keep you going, but I can never say thank you enough. Or I've tried to talk about this so many times, and every time I just can't form words. There are not words to adequately convey how grateful I am, how appreciative I am of those people that made me feel like a human, that treated me with dignity and respect. And I hope that stories like mine are enough to keep you going, because I know that's not always the outcome. After being in the ICU for 8 weeks or so, I eventually made it to rehab, where I think I was there for 3 weeks before I went home. But I did carry some of the mental issues with me, and I think that, combined with my body trying to normalize after being on those heavy medications for so long, it took me a good week. In fact, there's a funny story about that. One of my physical therapists, her name is Addison. I have no memory of this, but she told me that I had been in rehab for a few days, somewhere along that first week. But she said that I was so mad at her because apparently I was married to a woman named Elise, and Elise lost her glasses, and I was really mad because Addison was not helping me look for her glasses. First of all, I am all for LGBTQ people, but I'm not gay, and I don't even know anybody named Elise. So where that came from, I have no idea. But that was in rehab. So apparently I was not playing with a full deck of cards. Sometime in rehab is when that was when I was finally able to start talking a little bit and kind of explain what I was experiencing and everything that happened, and was diagnosed with PTSD. They started me on Cymbalta, and within 2 days of the Cymbalta, I was a completely different person. For me, that made a major difference, and I am very, very thankful for that. I still take Cymbalta. I will probably stay on it indefinitely unless I start having a problem. I don't know, but it definitely helped me in a very, very low point of my life. So if you are early on in your recovery after some major trauma and you don't know what your future looks like, I would like to offer you this. You may not know what your future looks like. I certainly don't know what your future looks like. But what I can tell you is that all of the days are not going to be like this. They're not all going to be bad, and they're not all going to be so hard. I have to think about it. It may not be tomorrow. It may be a week from now or a month from now. But you will have a good day again. And I can promise you that those good days are going to be so much sweeter. And you're going to appreciate them so much more. You do have plenty to look forward to. It just may seem a little murky right now, but I would just want to encourage you to lean on your people and keep fighting. It won't always be like this. It may not always be what it was before, but it might even be better. I would also like to say thank you for 10K and 1 million channel views. This all happened on my birthday while I was away on a camping trip. So thank you guys for that, especially to all of my channel members, the new ones and the ones that have been here since the beginning. I just appreciate you so much. You guys have been so kind and so supportive and made this such a more enjoyable experience. I'm honestly not sure yet what next week's podcast is going to be about. I'm thinking about doing an episode on some of the things that I've learned, some of the life lessons I've learned through this. But if you have any questions or anything you're just dying to know, make sure to drop a comment and I will hopefully include that in the next video. Y'all have a great rest of the week and I will see you all very soon.